Welcome, dear traveler, to another gentle evening in the company of old stories and ancient voices. Here at Olympus Dreams, we gather the threads of myth and weave them into something soft enough to carry you toward rest. Tonight, we follow a story that begins not with thunder, but with silence. The desperate, hope-filled silence of a mother hiding her child from a father who would devour him. Let us begin where all great stories must, in darkness, in secrecy, and in the patient unfolding of fate. On the island of Crete, where limestone cliffs rise white against an endless sky, there exists a cave. Not grand or decorated with the careful hands of priests, but raw and ancient, carved by water and time into the living bone of Mount Ida. The entrance is narrow, hidden behind curtains of ivy and wild rosemary that fill the air with their sharp, keen scent. Inside, the darkness is complete and cool, broken only by the occasional drip of water from stalactites that have been growing since before gods had names. It is here, in this secret place far from marble halls and golden thrones, that Rhea came in the depth of night. She moves slowly, one hand pressed against the damp stone wall for balance, the other cradling something precious against her chest. Her feet were bare, silent on the smooth cave floor worn by centuries of groundwater. She had walked for hours through mountain passes and olive groves, avoiding roads, speaking to no one, her heart beating with the terrible rhythm of fear and determination mixed together like wine and water. Rhea was a Titaness, daughter of earth and sky, sister and wife to Kronos, who ruled the cosmos from his throne of adamant. 5 times she had given birth. 5 times she had held an infant to her breast, breathed in that sweet new smell that all mothers know. 5 times she had watched her husband take the child from her arms and swallow it whole. Hestia first, gentle even as a newborn. Then Demeter, who had grasped Rhea's finger with surprising strength. Hera came third, already imperious in her infant gaze. Hades followed, silent and watchful. And finally Poseidon, who had cried with a voice like distant waves. All of them gone, consumed by their father's fear, imprisoned in the darkness of his belly where no light reached, and no voice could call for help. Kronos had his reasons, of course. Tyrants always do. He had been warned by prophecy that one of his children would overthrow him, just as he had overthrown his own father Uranus in that ancient bloody rebellion that still echoed through the bones of the world. He would not wait for fate to choose its moment. He would devour destiny itself, child by child, until the threat was eliminated. But Rhea had reached her limit. When she felt the 6th child quickening in her womb, she made her choice. She would not surrender this one. She would not stand silent while another infant disappeared into that terrible darkness. She would lie, hide, deceive if necessary. She would become a rebel against her own husband, and she would do it alone. The birth came in the cave, attended only by the spirits of the mountain, nymphs who moved like shadows and spoke in whispers, ancient beings who remembered when the earth was young. They brought clean water from a spring that had never seen sunlight, and soft wool from sheep who grazed on slopes where eagles nested. They sang to Rhea in the old language, the one that existed before words, and their voices blended with the sound of dripping water and distant wind until the cave itself seemed to breathe. When the child emerged, he did not cry. His eyes opened immediately, bright and aware, and for a moment Rhea forgot her fear in the simple wonder of looking at him. He was small, as all newborns are, but there was something in his gaze that suggested he would not remain small for long. His tiny fists opened and closed, as if already grasping for something just beyond reach. She wrapped him in the wool the nymphs had brought and held him close while her heart broke and mended and broke again. "Zeus," she whispered, naming him for the first time. The word meant bright sky, or perhaps it meant something older that language had forgotten. He was hers, and she would keep him safe. But safety required deception. From outside the cave, one of the nymphs brought what had been gathered, a stone from the mountainside, worn smooth by weather, roughly the size and weight of an infant. Rhea took the stone in her trembling hands and wrapped it in fresh swaddling cloth, working carefully, tucking the edges just so, until it looked like any newborn sleeping soundly. She even dampened the cloth slightly, mimicking the warmth of skin. She handed Zeus to the eldest of the nymphs, a being whose hair was the color of moonlight on water. "Guard him," Rhea said, and her voice was steady despite everything. "Let no one know he lives. Raise him in secret until the time comes." The nymph nodded once, solemn as an oath, and melted back into the deeper darkness of the cave, where even divine sight could not easily follow. Then Rhea began the long walk back. She carried the stone child carefully, letting it rest against her shoulder as she descended the mountain paths. Dawn was beginning to touch the eastern sky with pale grey light by the time she reached the palace. Kronos was waiting in the great hall, seated on his throne of dark metal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "Well?" His voice was deep, patient, the voice of someone who has never been successfully defied. Rhea approached slowly. She kept her eyes lowered, playing the part of the defeated wife, the exhausted mother. She held out the bundle. "Another son," she said quietly. The grief in her voice was not false. She was grieving, though not for the reason Kronos would assume. He took the bundle from her without ceremony. For a moment he looked down at what he held, and Rhea's heart stopped completely in her chest. If he noticed, if he suspected, if he unwrapped the cloth and saw stone instead of skin. But Kronos was arrogant, and arrogance makes for poor observation. He had done this 5 times before. Why would this time be different? He opened his mouth wide, wider than should have been possible, a darkness that seemed to lead somewhere other than a throat, and swallowed the stone whole. Rhea watched him consume the rock that would eventually be his undoing. She watched him settle back into his throne, satisfied that the threat had been neutralized once again. She watched him wave his hand in dismissal, already forgetting about her. And she said nothing. She simply bowed and withdrew, walking slowly through the marble corridors until she was alone, and then she allowed herself to weep. But they were not tears of despair, not entirely. Mixed with the grief was something else, something harder and brighter and more dangerous. Hope. Fragile as new leaves, persistent as water wearing down stone. Her son lived. Somewhere on a mountain far from here, wrapped in starlight and secrecy, Zeus was breathing his first breaths of free air. Back in the cave, the nymphs prepared for their long guardianship. They cleared a space among the stones and made it soft with moss and wool. They brought offerings to the ancient powers of the mountain, asking for protection and discretion. And when Zeus began to cry at last, hungry and confused by this strange new world, they summoned something unexpected, a goat. Not an ordinary goat, but Amalthea, a creature of divine lineage whose milk was said to carry the essence of immortality itself. She approached the infant with careful steps, her eyes wise and kind, and allowed him to nurse. Her milk was warm and rich, tasting of spring meadows and mountain flowers, and Zeus drank deeply. From that first feeding, a bond formed between them that would last beyond her mortal span. When Amalthea eventually died, Zeus would honor her by placing her hide among the stars, creating the constellation that mortals would one day call Capricorn. Other guardians gathered as well. The Curetes came, divine warriors who had served the old gods before Kronos' reign. They were beings of rhythm and noise, and they understood what needed to be done. Whenever the infant Zeus cried, they would dance around the cave entrance, clashing their bronze shields together in complex patterns that created a sound like thunder rolling through mountains. The noise echoed across the valleys and peaks, and anyone who heard it, shepherd or wandering spirit, assumed it was merely a storm passing through. No one suspected that beneath that bronze percussion, a child was growing who would one day shake the foundations of heaven. Seasons turned slowly in that hidden place. Spring brought wild flowers that the nymphs wove into garlands. Summer filled the cave with warm breezes that smelled of thyme and sage. Autumn painted the mountainside in colors of bronze and gold, and winter sent cold winds that never quite reached into the cave's sheltered depths. Through it all, Zeus grew. He was not like mortal children who take years to walk and speak. Divine blood moves faster, burns brighter. By the time snow fell on Mount Ida for the second time since his birth, Zeus could run along the narrow paths outside the cave, sure-footed as the goats who grazed there. He could speak in full sentences, asking questions that made even the ancient nymphs pause to consider their answers, and he had begun to notice the sky. He would stand at the cave entrance for hours, watching clouds build and dissolve, tracking the paths of birds, studying the way light changed from dawn to dusk. "Why does it move?" he asked once, pointing at the sun. The eldest nymph sat beside him on the sun-warmed stone and tried to explain about celestial mechanics and the daily journey of Helios in his golden chariot. But Zeus shook his head. "No," he said. "I mean, why does it want to move? What is it looking for?" Such questions had no easy answers, but they revealed something important. This child did not see the world as a fixed thing to be accepted. He saw it as something alive, something with purpose and desire. He saw it as something that could be questioned, and perhaps, eventually, commanded. At night, when the nymphs thought he was sleeping, Zeus would lie awake and listen to their whispered conversations. They spoke carefully, these ancient beings, choosing their words with the precision of those who know that knowledge can be both gift and burden. But Zeus had sharp ears, and slowly, piece by piece, he learned the truth of his origin. He learned about Kronos and the terrible hunger that had consumed his siblings. He learned about Rhea's desperate gamble and the stone that sat even now in his father's belly alongside 5 gods who waited in darkness. He learned about prophecy and fate, about the war between Titans and the old order that had come before them. And he learned that he was not simply a hidden child, but a promise, a potential, a storm waiting to break. The knowledge settled into him like rain into earth, changing something fundamental in the way he moved through the world. His games became more serious, more focused. When he wrestled with the young goats, he was learning leverage and strength. When he climbed the cliffs, he was testing his limits. When he stared at the sky, he was no longer just watching. He was planning. The nymphs noticed the change and said nothing. What could they say? They had been tasked with keeping him safe, not keeping him innocent. Destiny has its own timeline, and it flows like water toward the sea. It can be diverted, perhaps, or slowed, but never truly stopped. And so they simply continued their guardianship, teaching him what they could, protecting him while he still allowed himself to be protected, and waiting for the day when he would descend from the mountain and claim what had been stolen from him before his first breath. The years passed slowly on Mount Ida, measured not in mortal calendars, but in the gradual deepening of understanding. Zeus grew tall and broad-shouldered, his limbs lengthening until he stood head and shoulders above the nymphs who had raised him. His hair darkened to the color of storm clouds, and his eyes, which had been soft and wondering in childhood, took on a quality that made even the mountain itself seem to pause and consider its moods before sending winds or rain. He spent his days ranging farther across the island, following goat paths that wound through groves of ancient olive trees and stands of cypress that swayed in the Mediterranean wind. He learned every cave and spring, every hidden valley where wild herbs grew thick and fragrant. The island became his education, each stone and stream a lesson in patience, in observation, in understanding how the world fit together. Amalthea, older now but still strong, would sometimes follow him on his wanderings, her hooves sure on the rocky paths. She had nursed him with milk that carried immortality, and there remained between them a bond deeper than words. When he sat beneath the stars, she would lie beside him, her warm flank pressed against his side, and together they would watch the constellations wheel slowly overhead. Zeus learned their names from the nymphs: Orion the hunter, the Pleiades fleeing across the dark, the Great Bear circling the pole, but he also gave them his own names, secret ones that he spoke only to himself and to the night. The curators still guarded the approaches to the cave, these bronze-clad warriors whose duties had outlasted their immediate purpose and become instead rituals of respect. They taught him their war dances, the patterns of shield and spear, the rhythms that could shake the earth or still the wind. Zeus learned quickly, his divine body responding to training with an ease that would have taken mortals decades to achieve. But it was not only martial skill that occupied his education. The nymphs, seeing that he had absorbed the truth of his origin, began to teach him other things, the hidden knowledge that flows beneath the surface of the world like water beneath stone. They taught him about the nature of oaths and the power of words spoken with intention. They showed him how to read the flight of birds and the patterns of wind in the trees. They explained the delicate balance between the mortal and divine realms, and how easily that balance could be disrupted by careless action. One nymph in particular, her name long and musical in the old tongue, taught him about wisdom and strategy. She would set him problems to solve, how to move a boulder without touching it, how to cross a stream without getting wet, how to win a contest without fighting. At first he approached these challenges with brute force, relying on his growing strength. But slowly he learned that power without thought was merely destruction, while power guided by intelligence could reshape the world. The seasons continued their ancient dance. Spring brought wildflowers that turned the mountainside into a carpet of color, crimson poppies, golden asphodels, purple irises that grew in the damp places near springs. Summer brought heat that made the stones warm to the touch and filled the air with the scent of wild thyme and oregano. Autumn painted the landscape in shades of bronze and gold, and winter sent snow to dust the highest peaks, though the cave remained always temperate, protected by some ancient magic woven into the stone itself. Zeus marked his growth not in years but in capabilities. The winter he could outrun a deer. The spring he lifted a stone that 3 men could not have moved. The summer he called down lightning for the first time, accidentally, in a moment of frustration, and watched it strike a dead tree, splitting it down to the roots. The nymphs had gasped, then smiled. It was beginning. Yet for all his growing power, there remained in Zeus a quality of gentleness that surprised even those who knew him best. He would spend hours watching ants carry seeds across stone, or sit motionless as a butterfly perched on his shoulder, its wings opening and closing in the sun. He learned the names of plants and their properties, which ones healed and which ones harmed. He tended to injured animals, setting the broken wing of a hawk, feeding a half-starved wolf cub until it was strong enough to rejoin its pack. This tenderness seemed to contradict the destiny that awaited him, the violence that would be necessary to overthrow his father and free his siblings. But perhaps the nymphs understood what Zeus himself did not yet fully grasp, that the greatest kings are those who know the value of what they protect. A king who had never known gentleness would rule only through fear. A king who understood both strength and mercy might rule through something closer to wisdom. As Zeus approached what might be called young manhood in divine terms, he began to speak more often of leaving the mountain. At first these were merely idle thoughts, expressed to Amalthea or to the wind, but gradually they took on weight and specificity. He would ask the nymphs about the world beyond Crete, about the courts of the Titans, about the path that led to his father's palace. They answered his questions carefully, neither encouraging nor discouraging, simply providing information as necessary sustenance for a mind preparing itself for action. He asked about his siblings, the 5 who waited in darkness. What were their names? What were they like? The nymphs told Zeus what they knew. Hestia, the eldest, gentle and constant as hearthfire. Demeter, who even in the womb had dreamed of grain and growing things. Hera, proud and strong-willed, unwilling to be diminished even by imprisonment. Hades, quiet and thoughtful, who had already been comfortable with darkness. And Poseidon, restless and wild, whose spirit churned like the sea he would someday command. Zeus committed these descriptions to memory, building in his mind images of siblings he had never met. They became real to him through repetition, through imagination, until he could almost hear Hestia's quiet voice, almost see Hera's fierce eyes, almost feel Poseidon's barely contained energy. They were waiting for him, had been waiting since before he drew his first breath, and he would not let them wait forever. The decision, when it finally crystallized, came during a storm. Zeus stood at the entrance to the cave, watching lightning split the sky, feeling the thunder roll through his chest like a second heartbeat. Rain came down in sheets, turning the mountain paths to streams, and the wind howled with a voice that sounded almost like language. The curettes had taken shelter deeper in the cave, and even the nymphs had withdrawn, leaving Zeus alone with the weather. He raised his hand, palm open to the sky, and felt something respond. Not the lightning itself. He was not yet strong enough to command the storm, but something beneath it, a current of power that ran through the world like blood through veins. It recognized him. It had been waiting for him. And in that moment of recognition, Zeus understood that his childhood was over. He could not remain hidden forever, safe in a cave while his siblings suffered in darkness and his father ruled through fear. The prophecy that had driven Kronos to such terrible acts was not a curse, but a promise. A new order was possible. Change was not only inevitable, but necessary. And he, Zeus, son of Kronos and Rhea, raised in secret and taught in wisdom, was the instrument through which that change would come. The storm passed. The clouds broke apart, revealing stars that seemed impossibly bright after the darkness. Zeus stood dripping in the cave entrance and felt calm settle over him like a cloak. The waiting was done. The preparation was complete. It was time to descend from the mountain and meet his destiny face to face. The nymphs found him at dawn, standing at the cave entrance with his few possessions gathered, a cloak woven from wool and starlight, a staff cut from olive wood, a pouch containing herbs and bread, and the small treasures of his childhood. They did not ask if he was leaving. They could see it in his stance, in the way he gazed down the mountain path toward the distant sea. Instead, they blessed him, each in turn, laying hands on his shoulders and speaking words that were older than language, words that hummed in the bones and settled into the soul. Amalthea stood nearby, and when the blessings were complete, Zeus knelt beside her and pressed his forehead to hers, breathing in the familiar scent of her warm hide, the smell of home and safety, and all the years he had spent growing beneath her watchful care. Then he stood, adjusted the pack on his shoulders, and began walking down the mountain path. He did not look back. Each step took him farther from the only home he had known, but also closer to the family he had never met and the throne he was destined to claim. The path was steep and rocky, winding down through olive groves and past springs where water bubbled clear and cold from the living rock. By midday he had descended below the snowline into regions where farmers tended small fields and shepherds watched their flocks. They saw him passing, a tall young man with storm-colored eyes and bearing that suggested nobility despite his simple clothes, and they nodded respectfully, sensing something in him that discouraged questions. By evening, Zeus reached the coast, where the sea spread before him like hammered bronze in the setting sun. He had never seen so much water, had only glimpsed the distant gleam of it from the mountain heights. Now it stretched to the horizon, vast and restless, and the salt wind that blew off it carried sense of distance and possibility. Somewhere across that water lay the wider world, the courts of power, the throne of his father, and the future that waited with the patience of stone. Zeus made camp on the beach, building a small fire from driftwood and sitting cross-legged in the sand as darkness fell and stars emerged overhead. The waves rolled in with their eternal rhythm, and he listened to their voices, finding in them something familiar, the same patient power he had felt in the mountain storms, the same deep certainty that change was coming, like tide returning to shore. Tomorrow he would find a boat, or perhaps simply walk across the water if his power proved sufficient. Tomorrow he would begin the journey toward his father's palace, toward the confrontation that prophecy demanded. Tomorrow the hidden prince would step fully into the light and claim his place in the story that poets would tell for thousands of years to come. But tonight he was still himself, Still the boy who had been raised in a cave by nymphs and a divine goat, who had learned gentleness alongside strength, who had studied the stars and given them secret names. Tonight he could rest, gathering his strength, preparing his spirit, letting the waves sing him toward sleep with their ancient, wordless song. The fire burned low, embers glowing red against the darkness. Zeus lay back in the sand, his eyes growing heavy, and watched the stars wheel slowly overhead. Somewhere up there, beyond the vault of heaven, his father sat on a throne of power and fear. But here, on this beach, beneath these stars, Zeus was simply himself, young, strong, ready, and absolutely certain that everything was about to change. The waves continued their rhythm, the stars continued their dance. And Zeus, breathing slow and deep, let himself drift into sleep, his dreams full of thunder and family, and the bright, terrible promise of destiny fulfilled. The disguise came easily, more easily than Zeus had expected. Perhaps the divine blood that ran through his veins carried with it an instinct for transformation, or perhaps necessity simply taught him what fear of discovery demanded. Either way, by the time he approached the great palace where his father held court, he no longer looked like a prince born of prophecy. He looked like a servant, unremarkable and easily forgotten. He had found clothing in a coastal village, simple garments worn by cupbearers and attendants, nothing that would draw a second glance. He dirtied them slightly, adding the authentic wear of labor, and bound his storm-dark hair back with plain cord. The staff of olive wood he left hidden among rocks near the shore, tucked away like a memory he would return to claim. In its place he carried only what servants carried, steady hands, downcast eyes, and the patient invisibility of those who exist to serve. The palace of Kronos rose before him like a mountain made of ambition. It was built of stones so massive that even titans must have strained to lift them, fitted together with such precision that no mortar was needed to hold them in place. Columns, thick as ancient trees, supported roofs that seemed to press against the sky itself. And everywhere there was gold, on door frames and window casings, woven through tapestries, gleaming from the edges of shields mounted on walls like captured suns. Zeus walked through the outer gates with a group of other servants, his gaze carefully lowered, his breathing controlled. Guards flanked the entrance, their armor polished to mirror brightness, their spears held at attention. But they barely glanced at the servants passing beneath their watch. Why would they? Servants were as common as stones, as constant as air, noticed only in their absence. Inside, the palace opened into chambers of intimidating scale. Ceilings soared overhead, supported by rows of columns carved with scenes of Titan victories, Kronos overthrowing Uranus, the establishment of his rule, the binding of the Cyclopes. Zeus kept his eyes on these carvings only briefly, long enough to understand the story they told, then returned his gaze to the floor as a proper servant should. But he had seen enough. These were not the decorations of a secure king. These were reminders, warnings, proof displayed like shields against doubt. He learned the palace by walking its corridors with other servants, carrying wine jars and bread baskets, fetching water from deep wells and oil for lamps that burned in chambers where Titans discussed matters of state. No one questioned his presence. A face becomes familiar through simple repetition, and Zeus made himself repetitious, appearing each day in the same plain clothing, doing the same unremarkable tasks, becoming part of the palace's rhythm like one more stone in its foundation. He watched everything. The way Kronos sat his throne, shoulders hunched slightly as if the weight of kingship had physical mass. The way the other Titans deferred to him, but carefully, each word measured, each gesture deliberate. There was fear here, running beneath the surface like water under ice. Even the king's allies did not trust him fully. Power maintained through violence never rests easy. Zeus saw his father clearly for the first time during a feast. Kronos sat at the head of a long table, surrounded by his brothers and sisters, the Titans who had helped him overthrow Uranus and maintain his rule. They ate from golden plates and drank from cups carved from single pieces of amber, their laughter echoing off marble walls. but their eyes remained watchful, and their hands never strayed far from the weapons they kept nearby even during celebration. Kronos himself was not what Zeus had imagined. He had expected a monster, something barely recognizable as divine. Instead, he saw a being who might once have been noble, tall and broad, with features that suggested strength tempered by time. But there was something eroded about him, as if worry had worn channels in his spirit, the way water wears channels in stone. His eyes moved constantly, never settling, always watching for threats that might emerge from any shadow. Zeus poured wine for the Titans, moving around the table with the careful anonymity of a trusted servant. When he reached his father, he paused for only a heartbeat, studying the face that was somehow familiar despite never having seen it before. This was the being who had swallowed his siblings. This was the king who ruled through fear. This was the father who had tried to eat him, would have succeeded if not for his mother's desperate cleverness. Kronos glanced up briefly as Zeus poured, their eyes meeting for a fraction of a second. Zeus kept his expression perfectly neutral, perfectly servile, and saw nothing in his father's gaze but the casual dismissal with which kings regard those beneath their notice. Then the moment passed. Kronos returned to his conversation, and Zeus moved on to the next cup, his heart beating steady despite the proximity to danger. That brief moment had told Zeus what he needed to know. His father did not recognize him. Could not recognize him. The child Kronos feared existed only in prophecy, only in imagination. He was watching for threats that announced themselves with thunder and divine radiance, not for enemies who approached with patience and wine jugs. In the evenings, when the palace settled into quieter rhythms, Zeus would retreat to the servants' quarters, a series of small chambers built into the palace's lower levels, near the kitchens and storerooms. There he would lie on his simple bed, listening to the sounds of other servants settling for sleep, and think about the task ahead. Freeing his siblings would require more than strength or courage. It would require knowledge, timing, and something his father had never possessed, wisdom that looked beyond immediate power toward longer consequences. It was during one of these quiet evenings that she appeared. Meti materialized in the shadows near his bed, as if she had been there all along, simply waiting to be noticed. She was smaller than he expected for a Titaness, her form compact and efficient, her eyes bright with intelligence that seemed to illuminate the dim chamber like lamplight. "You hide yourself well," she said softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. "But some things cannot be hidden from those who know how to look." Zeus sat up slowly, every muscle ready, though he kept his expression calm. "I don't know what you mean. Of course you don't." Meti smiled, and there was kindness in it alongside the knowing. "You're simply a servant who pours wine with hands that have never known calluses from labor, whose eyes measure distances even while pretending to watch the floor." There seemed little point in continuing the pretense. Zeus met her gaze directly, letting her see for the first time the storm-colored eyes he had kept carefully downcast for weeks. "If you know who I am, why haven't you told the king?" "Because I know what you are," Meti replied, settling herself on the edge of his bed with ease. "The answer to a question that has been waiting since before you were born," she explained then in quiet tones that did not carry beyond the chamber walls, that she had been watching for his coming. Gaia herself had whispered hints in dreams, and Meti had learned long ago to pay attention to the Earth's quiet counsel. She knew about Rhea's deception, about the child raised in hiding, about the prophecy that drove Kronos to terrible acts of self-preservation. "He is not wrong to fear you," she said, and her voice held neither judgment nor pity, simply statement of fact. "You will overthrow him. The question is not whether, but how." Zeus studied her face, seeing in it a complexity that reminded him of the nymphs who had raised him. "And you want to help me? Why?" "Because the current order is unsustainable." Meti folded her hands in her lap, her expression thoughtful. "Your father rules through fear, swallowing everything that threatens him. But you cannot build eternity on terror. Eventually, the foundation cracks. She reached into the folds of her garment and withdrew a small vial, its glass dark and ancient, containing liquid that moved with strange thickness. This is what you need. A potion crafted from herbs that grow only in the deepest parts of the earth. It will cause him to release what he has consumed. But it must be administered carefully, and you must be ready for what follows. Zeus took the vial, feeling its weight, not physical weight, but the weight of consequence, of action that once taken could never be undone. The glass was cool against his palm. How will I know when the moment is right? You will know. Meti rose, preparing to leave as silently as she had arrived. Trust the timing that brought you here. Trust the patience you learned on the mountain. She paused at the threshold, glancing back. When this is done, when you sit where your father now sits, remember this conversation. Remember that wisdom means knowing not just how to seize power, but how to wield it without becoming the thing you overthrew. Then she was gone, leaving only shadows and the vial in Zeus's hand. The following days passed with agonizing slowness. Zeus continued his servant's duties, pouring wine and carrying trays, invisible among the palace's daily rhythms. But now the vial weighed heavy in the pouch at his belt, its presence a constant reminder of the threshold he approached. He watched Kronos carefully, learning his patterns, his preferences, the subtle rhythms of his routine. The king took wine in the evening, always from the same cup, an ancient vessel carved from a single piece of obsidian, its surface smooth as still water. He drank alone, or nearly so, attended only by a handful of servants who kept respectful distance. It was a moment of rare vulnerability when the king set aside his crown and his constant vigilance. Zeus waited for the new moon, when darkness lay heaviest over the palace and shadows gathered thick in every corner. On that night he prepared the wine himself, pouring it from the amphora in the king's private chamber, his hand steady despite the thunderous beating of his heart. He opened the vial Meti had given him, and 3 drops, no more, no less, fell into the obsidian cup, disappearing into the dark wine like stars falling into night sky. The potion had no scent that Zeus could detect, no visible presence. But when he lifted the cup, he felt something stir in it, some active intention that went beyond mere herbs and water. This was crafted justice, bottled consequence, prophecy preparing to fulfill itself. Kronos entered his chamber as twilight deepened toward full dark. He looked older than during the day, the weight of his rule visible in the set of his shoulders, the deep lines bracketing his mouth. Zeus approached with the wine, moving with the practiced invisibility of a servant who had served this same wine on 100 previous evenings. "Your wine, my lord," he said quietly, offering the obsidian cup with both hands, his eyes properly downcast. Kronos took it without looking at him, without acknowledgement, already turning toward the window where stars were beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. Zeus stepped back, assuming the waiting posture of a servant ready to be summoned or dismissed. The king drank deeply, as was his custom. The wine went down smooth and dark, and for a long moment nothing happened. Zeus waited, barely breathing, wondering if the potion had failed, if prophecy itself could be mistaken. Then Kronos staggered. His hand went to his stomach, his face contorting with sudden pain. The obsidian cup fell from his grip, shattering on the marble floor into 1,000 dark fragments. The king doubled over, a groan rising from depths that had nothing to do with simple physical discomfort. Zeus stood perfectly still, watching as the potion did its work. This was not violence of his making. This was simply truth asserting itself, what had been wrongly consumed now demanding release. Kronos fell to his knees, his body convulsing with spasms that shook the very floor, and then, with a sound that seemed to echo from the foundations of the world itself, he began to release what he had swallowed. First came the stone, the one Rhea had substituted, emerging whole and unharmed. It struck the floor with a sound like a bell being struck, clear and resonant. Then came the gods. Poseidon emerged first, rising from the darkness with eyes wide, seawater streaming from his hair, though he had been nowhere near the ocean. He stood gasping, disoriented, fully grown and powerful, despite having been imprisoned before drawing a single free breath. Hades followed, stepping from darkness into darkness, his expression calm despite the strangeness of his emergence, as if being born twice was something to be accepted rather than questioned. Then Hera, furious and magnificent, her eyes blazing with rage so pure it seemed to light the chamber from within. Demeter came next, bringing with her the scent of grain and growing things, her hands already reaching toward earth she had never touched but somehow knew. And finally Hestia, eldest and gentlest, who looked around the chamber with quiet understanding, as if she had always known this moment would arrive, and had simply been waiting with patient certainty. They stood together, these 5 divine beings who had never known freedom, blinking in the lamplight of their father's chamber, slowly beginning to understand what had happened, where they were, and who had freed them. Zeus stepped forward from the shadows, letting them see him clearly for the first time. He removed the simple cord that bound his hair, letting it fall loose around his shoulders. He stood straight, no longer maintaining the careful posture of a servant, and met their eyes one by one. "I am Zeus," he said quietly, his voice carrying despite its softness. "Your brother, your liberator, and, if you will have me, your ally in what must come next." The silence that followed held its breath like the moment between lightning and thunder. 5 gods, still dripping with the darkness of their father's belly, stood in the lamplight of a chamber that seemed suddenly too small for the weight of what had just occurred. Behind them, Kronos remained collapsed on the marble floor, his body still shaking with the violence of what had been forced from him. Poseidon was the first to speak, his voice rough as if words were stones he had to dislodge from his throat. "Brother?" The word came out, half question, half wonder. His eyes, the color of deep water where sunlight cannot reach, fixed on Zeus with an intensity that might have been gratitude or might have been judgment. Too early yet to tell which. Zeus met that gaze steadily, understanding that everything balanced on this moment. These were not children to be commanded or subjects to be ruled. These were gods who had lost decades, perhaps centuries, trapped in darkness while the world turned without them. "Yes," he said simply, "born after you, but raised in secret. Hidden on Crete while our father searched for threats that announced themselves. I wore servitude like borrowed clothing, waiting for the right moment to bring you back." Hades moved then, stepping closer with footfalls that made no sound on the marble. He was tall and quiet, his presence somehow managing to be both unobtrusive and absolute, like shadow that knows its own power but feels no need to demonstrate it. He studied Zeus's face with eyes that seemed to see through flesh to whatever truth lay beneath. "You could have fled," Hades observed, his tone neither accusing nor praising, simply stating fact. "Gone anywhere, remained hidden, lived freely while we remained imprisoned. Instead, you walked into the house of the one who would have swallowed you with all the rest." "I could have," Zeus agreed. "But then I would have been alone beneath a sky ruled by fear, and you would have remained in darkness until time itself forgot your names. That seemed the wrong story to let stand." Hera stepped forward abruptly, her movement sharp with barely contained fury. She was magnificent in her rage, her dark hair wild around her face, her eyes blazing with fire that had been banked too long. "You speak of stories," she said, her voice cutting like bronze through silk. "We were not stories. We were children, swallowed before we could draw breath, conscious in darkness while ages passed outside." "You cannot imagine." Her voice broke, just for a moment, just enough to reveal the grief beneath the anger. Then she mastered herself, drawing up straight, refusing to show weakness even before those who might understand it best. Zeus did not look away from that fury. "You're right," he said quietly. "I cannot imagine it. I was raised on mountainsides with goats and nymphs, learning the world through seasons and stories. But I knew what had been done to you. Every day I knew." And every day I prepared for this moment, when I could give you back what was stolen." Demeter, who had been silent until now, reached down and touched the marble floor with her fingertips. Where her hand made contact, a thin crack appeared, and from that crack, impossibly, a single blade of grain sprouted, green and alive despite the stone beneath it. She watched it grow with an expression that held both wonder and sorrow. "The earth remembers us," she said softly. "Even after all this time, locked away from sun and soil, the earth knows our names." She looked up at Zeus, and her eyes held a complexity beyond simple anger or gratitude. "You freed us, but what happens now? Our father still breathes behind us. The Titans still hold power. We are newborn to a world that has forgotten us." Zeus glanced past them to where Kronos was beginning to stir, pushing himself to hands and knees with movements that spoke of both weakness and gathering rage. The king had been emptied of his children, his terrible secret exposed. He would not remain collapsed for long. "We leave," Zeus said simply. "Now, together. And we decide what comes next, not in this chamber, but somewhere we can speak without his shadow listening." Hestia, who until now had remained perfectly still, finally moved. She walked to where the obsidian cup lay shattered on the floor and knelt beside the fragments. Her hands moved over them gently, as if she could piece them back together through will alone. "Nothing goes back to what it was," she said, her voice carrying a weight of wisdom that seemed strange coming from one so newly freed. "The cup shatters, the wine spills. What was contained is released, and the world must adjust to the new shape of things." She stood, turning to face Zeus with eyes that held the steady flame of hearth fire, constant and untroubled by wind. "We will come with you, not because you command it, but because you are right. This house has held us too long in darkness. It is time to see what light looks like." Behind them, Kronos spoke for the first time since emptying his belly of gods and stone. His voice was a ragged whisper that still managed to fill the chamber. "Fools, all of you. Do you think this changes anything? Do you think, because he freed you, you are truly free?" Zeus turned to face his father. In the king's expression lived not rage, but something more terrible, the hollow fear of someone watching prophecy fulfill itself despite every attempt at prevention. Kronos pushed himself to his feet, swaying slightly, his hands empty, but his presence still commanding through sheer force of ancient authority. "You should have stayed in the shadows, boy," Kronos said, and now his voice was strengthening, drawing power from some deep well of will. "Should have remained hidden and small. Now you have announced yourself, and now I know exactly what face to watch for when the threat finally comes." "The threat is already here," Zeus replied, his tone level, stating truth without drama or flourish. "It was here the moment you swallowed the first of your children. Every act of fear you performed was a stone laid on the path that led to this moment." Kronos' laugh was bitter, hollow as wind through empty corridors. "You think you understand rule. You think you understand what it means to hold power while knowing that power carries the seed of its own ending. But you are young, and young gods always believe they will be different, that they will escape the patterns that bind all who sit the throne." He straightened, and despite his weakness, despite the emptiness that had been forced from him, he still carried the bearing of a king who had ruled for ages uncounted. "Go then. Flee with your siblings, gather whatever allies you can find. But know this, prophecy or no prophecy, I will not yield my throne without war. And war, young Zeus, is something you have never known, not truly. Not as I know it." The 5 freed gods moved closer to Zeus, forming a loose circle around him. Not protection precisely, but presence, solidarity. The physical statement that they stood together now, regardless of what came next. 6 siblings where before there had been one, multiplied by a shared purpose that had weight beyond simple numbers. Zeus met his father's gaze one final time. "I did not come here seeking war," he said. "I came seeking justice." But if war is what justice requires, then war is what will come. Poseidon placed a hand on Zeus's shoulder, his grip firm, salt water still dripping from his fingers to pool on the marble floor. "We should go," he said quietly, "before the guards arrive, before this chamber fills with titans who will not be swayed by truth or prophecy." Zeus nodded. Together, the six of them moved toward the chamber's entrance, leaving Kronos standing alone among the shattered fragments of his obsidian cup, the stone that had deceived him lying nearby like an accusation. The king made no move to stop them. Perhaps he could not. Perhaps he simply chose not to, understanding that some moments must be allowed to unfold without interference, that prophecy has its own momentum that even gods cannot hold. They moved through the palace corridors swiftly but without panic, Zeus leading the way along paths he had memorized during his weeks of servitude. Servants they passed stepped quickly aside, their eyes wide but their voices silent, as if they understood that what they were witnessing was better left unremarked upon. Guards stood frozen at their posts, torn between duty and the primal recognition that divine forces were in motion around them. The outer gates stood open to the night, and beyond them lay darkness thick enough to hide gods and their intentions. Zeus paused at the threshold, glancing back once at the palace that had been his father's seat of power. It looked smaller now, its massive stones and gold decorations suddenly revealed as props and pretense, a stage set for a drama that was finally reaching its inevitable conclusion. "Where do we go?" Hera asked, her voice still carrying echoes of fury, but now mixed with something else. Uncertainty, perhaps, or the strange liberation of not knowing what came next, but trusting it would reveal itself. Zeus looked up at the sky, where stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, unconcerned with the dramas of gods or mortals. He thought of Crete, of the cave where he had been born, of Amalthea and the curetas, and the quiet years of preparation. He thought of Metis and her wisdom, of Gaia's whispered counsel in dreams. "To Olympus," he said finally, the name emerging with certainty, as if it had been waiting in his throat all along. "There is a mountain, higher than the throne of Titans, where the air is thin and clean. We will make our stand there. And from there, when we are ready, we will decide what justice looks like when gods unite for purpose rather than power." Poseidon smiled, the expression transforming his face, revealing joy that had been stored up through all his years of darkness. "Olympus?" he repeated, testing the word. "Yes." "That sounds right. That sounds like the beginning of something vast." Hades said nothing, but his silence held agreement, the quiet acceptance of one who understands that some decisions need not be debated, only followed to their natural conclusion. Demeter reached out and took Hestia's hand, then Hera's, forming a chain between them. A gesture simple and profound. Sisters reunited, touching for the first time in living memory, feeling the warmth of flesh that was not shadow, not darkness, not the terrible isolation of their father's belly. And so they walked together into the darkness, six gods who had never known freedom, now learning what it meant to choose their own direction. Behind them, the palace blazed with lamplight. Somewhere within those walls, Kronos stood among the fragments of his power, feeling perhaps for the first time the weight of prophecy fulfilled. The night wrapped around them like a cloak. In the distance, thunder rumbled, though no storm clouds darkened the star-scattered sky. It was simply the sound of power recognizing itself, of destiny beginning to gather like weather on a horizon that had been clear too long. They walked until dawn began to paint the eastern sky with colors that seemed invented fresh for this particular morning. When they finally stopped to rest, settling in a grove of olive trees far from any road or settlement, they sat together in a circle. These six who had never sat together before began to learn each other's voices, each other's stories, each other's names, spoken not in darkness, but in the gentle light of a world they would soon reshape. Poseidon spoke of dreams he had carried in the darkness, dreams of water, endless and deep, where currents moved like living things and creatures sang in voices that had no words. Hades spoke of silence, of the strange comfort he had found in the absolute quiet of their imprisonment, how it had taught him that darkness need not be feared when one learned to see with different eyes. Hera spoke little, her anger not yet ready to transform into something softer. But she listened, and her listening was a kind of gift, a presence that acknowledged without demanding, that witnessed without judging. Demeter pressed her palms to the earth and felt it respond, soil warming beneath her touch, seeds stirring in their winter sleep, though the season was not yet right for growth. Hestia built a small fire without flint or tinder, simply willing flame into being, and they gathered around its warmth as the sun climbed higher. Zeus watched them all, these siblings he had freed, these gods who were still learning what it meant to be themselves. He felt the weight of what he had set in motion, the war that would surely come, the battles that would shake the foundations of the world. But he felt something else too, hope, perhaps. Or the quiet certainty that what had begun in darkness would find its way to light. The olive trees rustled overhead, their leaves silver green in the morning sun. Birds began to sing, unaware that God sat beneath their branches, unaware that the world had just shifted on its axis. And perhaps that was the way of things. The great changes happened in moments, in chambers lit by lamplight, in decisions made in darkness. But life continued around them, indifferent and beautiful, reminding even gods that the world was larger than their conflicts, older than their power, and would continue long after their names had faded into stories told by fires that had not yet been kindled. The grove's peace did not last long. It could not. Peace was a luxury. The world no longer offered to gods who had announced themselves, who had stood against the ancient order and walked away carrying their defiance like torches in the night. 3 days they remained among the olive trees. 3 days of quiet counsel, of voices learning to harmonize after decades of forced silence. They spoke of what they remembered from before, fragments of childhood that had been interrupted before childhood could properly begin. They spoke of what they had felt in the darkness, and they spoke carefully, gently, of what might come next. But on the morning of the 4th day, the sky changed. Clouds gathered with unnatural speed, piling upon themselves like grey wool. The air grew heavy with a pressure that had nothing to do with approaching rain. The birds fell silent. The olive leaves ceased their rustling despite the wind that had begun to rise. Hades stood first, his eyes fixed on the northern horizon where the clouds were darkest. "He's coming," he said simply, his voice carrying the flat certainty of one who recognizes inevitability when it approaches. Zeus rose beside him, following his brother's gaze. In the distance, movement rippled through the landscape. Not armies marching, not yet, but the gathering of power, the pulling together of forces that had slept content until now. The Titans were waking to the news. Kronos had rallied them. The war the old king had promised would not wait for the gods to feel ready. They left the grove that same morning, moving swiftly through terrain that grew rougher with each passing mile. Zeus led them northward toward the mountain he had named, toward Olympus, whose peak stood so high that clouds caught on its shoulders like sheep in brambles. It was a journey of many days. And, as they traveled, the world around them began to shift. Signs of disturbance marked the land. Rivers ran backward for stretches, confused by competing divine wills. Trees grew in strange directions, their branches reaching toward earth, while roots clawed at sky. The very stones beneath their feet seemed uncertain, as if the ground itself sensed that the old order was fracturing. They passed through valleys where shepherds watched them from distances, driving their flocks to higher ground and making signs against evil, though they could not have said what evil approached. They skirted villages where smoke rose from evening fires, and children played in dusty squares, unaware that gods walked roads their fathers had walked, that the age of Titans was ending while they slept. Poseidon grew restless as they traveled. He would drift away from the group at night, drawn toward whatever water source lay nearest. Streams, rivers, even still ponds, all called to him with voices his siblings could not hear. He would stand at the water's edge for hours, his eyes distant, his hands moving in slow patterns as if conducting invisible currents. One night, Zeus found him beside a mountain stream, watching moonlight break itself on the moving surface. "It speaks to me," Poseidon said without turning. "All of it. Every drop, every current. They're confused, the waters. They feel the old rules breaking and don't know what new shape to take." "Then teach them," Zeus suggested quietly. "When this is finished, when we have won the right to rule, the seas will be yours to command. You can teach them whatever new shape serves best." Poseidon smiled at that, but the expression carried sadness along with anticipation. "And if we lose? If Kronos casts us back into darkness or destroys us entirely?" Zeus had no answer. That was not a guess or hope disguised as certainty. So he simply placed a hand on his brother's shoulder and stood with him in the silence, watching moonlight dance on water that would soon enough become weapon or ally. Hera walked always at the center of their group, her bearing regal despite the dust of travel, her anger banking but never fully cooling. She spoke rarely. But when she did speak, her words carried weight that made even Zeus pause to consider. She had an instinct for power, for the architecture of authority that went beyond simple strength. She understood how rule was maintained, how loyalty was earned or demanded, how symbols mattered as much as sword edges. "When we reach Olympus," she said one evening as they made camp in a narrow defile between cliffs, "we cannot simply claim it and wait for our father to come test us. We need to declare ourselves properly. Make it known that we are not rebels cowering in high places, but rightful rulers claiming what should have been ours from birth." Demeter looked up from where she was coaxing grain to grow from the rocky soil, creating their evening meal from elements that should not have been able to sustain life. "And how does one declare divinity?" she asked, her tone neither mocking nor challenging, simply curious. "By shaping the world to prove it," Hera answered. "Let them see what we can do. Let them see that we command forces Kronos never mastered. Then let them choose which future they prefer." Hestia tended the fire as she always did, her hands moving with practiced grace, though she had never built a fire before her imprisonment. "Choice," she said softly, her eyes reflecting dancing light. "That's what frightens him most. Not our power, but that we might offer the world something he never did, the freedom to follow willingly rather than through fear." Zeus listened to them speak, to these sisters who were relearning voices they had barely known before silence claimed them. They were right, both of them. Power alone would not win this struggle. Kronos had power, and had wielded it for ages beyond counting. What they needed was something else, something the old king had never understood, because fear had made him blind to it. They needed to prove that the cosmos could be ruled, not through consumption and control, but through balance, through each god claiming dominion over their natural realm and allowing others to do the same. It was this thought that occupied Zeus as they climbed higher, as the air grew thin and cold, as Olympus finally revealed itself fully against the sky. The mountain was tremendous, its peak lost in clouds that never seemed to break, its slopes steep enough that mortal climbers would have turned back before reaching even the lower ridges. But they were not mortal. They climbed through snowfields where their footprints melted the moment they passed. They climbed past caves where ancient things stirred but did not emerge, recognizing power greater than their own. They climbed until the world below became abstract, a tapestry of valleys and forests and distant seas that looked painted rather than real. Near the summit, they found a plateau. It was not large, perhaps half a mile across, but it was flat and solid and offered a view in all directions that seemed to encompass the entire world. Stone formations jutted from the ground like broken teeth, and the wind that swept across the space carried the sharp, clean taste of altitude and isolation. "Here," Zeus said, and the word came out with finality. "This is where we make our stand." They set about transforming the plateau with the instinct of creatures who understood their own nature. Hestia built a great hearth at the center, a circle of stones around flame that would never go out, anchoring them to the space. Demeter walked the perimeter, touching soil and coaxing it to fertility despite the elevation and cold, creating gardens that should not have been able to exist at such height. Poseidon found a spring, a trickle of water emerging from between rocks, and widened it through will alone until it became a flowing fountain that sang with a voice like distant oceans. Hades carved chambers into the rock face, creating spaces of shadow and quiet where one could think without the distraction of light. Hera designed the layout, her eye for proportion and symbol, turning their efforts from random improvements into something that resembled purpose, permanence, the architectural statement that they intended to remain. And Zeus stood at the edge of the plateau, looking out over the world that would soon become battlefield, and wondered if they were ready. If anyone could ever be ready for what approached. The answer came sooner than expected. On the third day after their arrival on Olympus, the Titans came, not in force, not yet, but in message. A figure appeared at the base of the mountain, alone, bearing the bronze staff of a herald. Zeus recognized him even from that distance. Chaos, the Titan of intellect and inquiry, one of Kronos' brothers who had always preferred questions to commands. Zeus descended alone to meet him, ignoring Hera's protest that it might be a trap. He walked down through snow and stone until he stood on level ground, a respectful distance from where Kronos waited. The Titan was old in a way, the new gods were not. Old in bearing, in the patient exhaustion of his posture, in the way his eyes held knowledge accumulated over so many centuries that memory itself had grown tired. He did not bow, but he inclined his head in acknowledgement of Zeus's presence. "You have made quite a disturbance," Kronos said, his voice like stones rubbing together, slow and careful. "My brother sent me to learn your intentions." "My intentions are simple," Zeus replied, "to rule justly what was stolen unjustly, to free what was imprisoned, to prove that power and fear need not be synonyms." Kronos smiled at that, but the expression held no joy. Brave words from one so young. "Tell me, Zeus of Crete, do you truly believe Kronos will yield to brave words? He who severed his own father, who swallowed his own children, who has held dominion over all existence since before mountains learned their names." "I believe," Zeus said carefully, "that he will yield to necessity, and if he will not yield, then he will fall. One way or another, the age of fear ends now." The old Titan studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he drove his bronze staff into the ground where it stood upright despite the rocky soil. "Then let this mark the place where herald met herald, where last chance for peace was offered and refused. Tell me, young god, will you accept terms?" "That depends on the terms." "Return to hiding. Take your siblings, disappear into the world's forgotten corners, live quietly, rule nothing, threaten no one. In exchange, Kronos swears by the river Styx that he will not hunt you, will allow you existence if not power." Kronos paused, then added more quietly, "It is more mercy than most would offer to those who have struck at them." Zeus felt anger kindle in his chest, hot and immediate, but he held it steady, refusing to let it control his voice. "And leave the world to be ruled by one who governs through fear? Who sees children only as threats? Who mistakes control for justice?" He shook his head slowly. "No. We did not endure what we endured only to become irrelevant in corners. We endured to stand here and say that rule built on fear must end." Kronos retrieved his staff, his movements deliberate and tired. "Then war it is. War that will shake creation to its roots. War that will drown the world in divine blood and mortal terror. I hope, young Zeus, that your certainty proves equal to the cost of proving it right." The Titan turned and began walking away, his figure growing smaller against the vast landscape. Zeus watched him go, feeling the weight of what had just been refused, the final door closing on any path except conflict. When he climbed back to the plateau, his siblings were waiting. They did not ask what had been said. They could see it in his face, in the set of his shoulders, in the way he looked past them toward the northern horizon where storm clouds were gathering with purpose now. "He'll come," Zeus said. "Kronos will bring the Titans, and they will bring everything they have held in reserve since creation began. This mountain will become the fulcrum on which the world tips one direction or another." Hades stepped forward, his expression calm, his voice carrying the strange peace of one who has already accepted whatever outcome awaits. "Then we prepare. We gather what allies we can. We learn to fight as gods should fight, with all the power at our command, and none of the hesitation that weakens resolve." Poseidon moved to stand beside him, then Demeter, then Hera, then Hestia. 6 gods in a circle, facing outward toward the world that was about to test them in ways none could fully imagine. And Zeus, standing among his siblings, feeling the first cold drops of rain beginning to fall from those distant storm clouds, understood that what approached was not simply war, but transformation. The cosmos would be remade by what happened next. Either Kronos would crush them and rule forever through terror renewed, or they would cast him down and prove that power could flow from something other than fear. The rain increased, falling harder now, drumming on stone and skin with insistence. Thunder rolled across the sky, though whether it came from Kronos' rage or Zeus's gathering power, none could say. The war had been declared. The Titanomachy had begun. And, on the plateau of Olympus, 6 gods stood together beneath a weeping sky, waiting for the storm to break fully, ready or not, willing or not, to defend the future they had chosen against the past that refused to release its grip. The rain fell for days without stopping, a curtain of water so thick that visibility shrank to arm's length, so persistent that even stone began to feel uncertain beneath its constant weight. The plateau of Olympus transformed into an island adrift in grey mist, isolated from the world below by weather that felt less like nature and more like pronouncement. Zeus stood at the edge where rock dropped away into nothing, his hair plastered to his skull, his robes heavy with water that never quite soaked through to skin. He had not moved since the rain began, his siblings noticed. He simply stood watching the clouds, listening to something they could not hear, learning a language that had no words. Hera approached him on the 4th day, moving carefully on stone slick as river ice. She had to raise her voice to be heard over the downpour. "You haven't eaten, haven't slept. Whatever you're doing, it won't serve if you collapse from exhaustion before the real battle begins." He did not turn, but his voice carried back to her surprisingly clear despite the water's roar. "I'm not exhausted. I'm listening. The storm is trying to teach me something." "Storms don't teach," Hera replied, but even as she said it, she knew it was wrong. Everything in this new existence was teaching them, offering instruction for those willing to pay attention. "What is it saying?" Zeus raised one hand, palm up, letting rain collect in the hollow. "That water falls from sky to earth, not because it chooses to, but because it must. That thunder is just air remembering how to breathe after lightning has taken its breath away. That weather is not chaos but pattern, the world breathing in and out on a scale so vast that mortals mistake it for randomness." He closed his hand slowly, and the water in his palm began to glow with pale light, not hot, but charged with something that made the air around it hum. Kronos thinks storms are weapons to be aimed. He's wrong. They're conversations between sky and earth about what form water should take, where wind should blow, when sunshine should return. "And if you understand the conversation," Hera said slowly, beginning to grasp what he meant, "then you can participate in it. Not control, but guide. Exactly." Zeus opened his hand and let the charged water fall, watched it join the natural rain, indistinguishable now from any other drop. The Titans tried to rule through control, through binding natural forces to their will. But will breaks eventually. Will tires. What we need is partnership with the forces we claim to command. Hera stood beside him in the rain, feeling it run through her hair, down her back, understanding suddenly why he had not sought shelter. He was not enduring the storm. He was introducing himself to it, making himself known to powers that predated even Titans, asking for alliance rather than demanding submission. Behind them, Hestia had kept the central hearth burning despite the deluge, her will maintaining flame that should have drowned under such water, but instead burned steady and warm. It was impossible, which meant it was divine, which meant the world was learning new rules, whether it wished to or not. Demeter worked in gardens that should not exist, her hands deep in soil that should not hold life at this elevation. But grain grew regardless, thick and golden, defying altitude and cold and the weight of endless rain. She sang while she worked, wordless melodies that made the plants grow faster, made roots dig deeper, made the earth remember what it felt like to be generous. Poseidon had disappeared into the fountain he had created, diving beneath its surface and not emerging for hours at a time. When he finally surfaced on the 5th day, his eyes had changed. They held depth now, reflected light in ways that suggested vast spaces hidden behind them, oceans not yet born but waiting. "The waters accept me," he said simply when Zeus asked what he had found. "Not just here, but everywhere. Rivers remembering their paths, seas testing their boundaries. Even the rain falling on my skin connects to rain falling everywhere else, and through that connection I can sense the shape of the world's water." He held up his hand, and water rose from the fountain without being touched, forming itself into a sphere that hung in air, perfect and contained. Kronos could never do this. The Titans are too old, too fixed in their understanding. They see water as element, as substance. But it's more, it's potential. The space between what is and what might be. The sphere collapsed back into the fountain with a sound like laughter, and Poseidon smiled, an expression that combined satisfaction with something deeper, recognition of kinship with forces vast beyond measuring. Hades spent the days of rain in the shadow chambers he had carved, not in meditation or rest, but exploring, testing the boundaries of what shadow meant, what darkness could contain. On the 6th day, Zeus found him standing in a chamber where no light penetrated, yet somehow the darkness was not absolute. It held texture, depth, the suggestion of vast spaces extending beyond what should have been merely absence of light. "There are places between," Hades said, his voice coming from the dark, directionless and strange. "Spaces that exist adjacent to the world, but not quite within it. The dead will need somewhere to go when mortals truly begin dying in numbers that matter. Somewhere that is neither here nor gone, neither life nor absolute ending." "You've been preparing for death," Zeus said quietly, "before war has even truly begun." "Death comes regardless of war," Hades replied, and now Zeus could see him, his form resolving from shadow not by light, but by presence, by the force of existence asserting itself against absence. It has always come, will always come. The difference is that now it will have a shepherd rather than just oblivion. The dead will have a destination, a realm, a ruler who understands that ending is not the same as ceasing to matter. He stepped forward into the dim light that marked the chamber's entrance, and Zeus saw that his brother's eyes had changed, grown darker but not dead, filled with a knowledge that was not cruel but profoundly, irrevocably serious. "When this war is done," Hades continued, "many will die. Gods, perhaps, certainly mortals caught in the edges. I will be ready to receive them. It is the least we owe to those who suffer for our conflict." The rain finally stopped on the 7th day, but the clouds did not break. They simply ceased weeping, hanging instead like a gray ceiling over the world, turning daylight into perpetual dusk. In that strange half-light, the first of the allies began to arrive. They came singly and in small groups, beings drawn by rumor or curiosity, or the simple instinct that power was shifting and new alliances might prove valuable. Nymphs from mountain streams, their forms barely solid, more water than flesh. Spirits of high places who had lived in solitude so long they have forgotten the shapes of their own names. Even a few younger Titans, children of those who now rallied to Kronos, but who saw in Zeus and his siblings something worth the risk of defection. Prometheus came on the 8th day, walking up through mist as if he had always been expected. He was tall and lean, his face marked with the kind of weariness that comes from seeing too far ahead, from knowing too many endings before their stories properly begin. He carried no weapons, needed none. His presence itself was offering and threat combined. "I've come to offer counsel," he said simply when Zeus met him at the plateau's edge. "Not allegiance, not yet. But I have watched what you are attempting, and it interests me. It may even be worth supporting if you prove capable of understanding what true rule requires." Zeus studied the Titan, this strange figure whose reputation preceded him, the one called Forethinker, who saw patterns where others saw only chaos. "And what does true rule require?" Prometheus smiled, and the expression held approval mixed with caution. "Rule requires knowing when to act and when to wait, when to strike and when to yield, when to command and when to listen. Your father never learned this. He knows only force, only control, only the fear that drives him to consume anything that might challenge his dominion." He gestured toward the plateau, toward where the other gods moved about their preparations, each mastering the powers that defined them. "You are learning something he never did. You are learning to work with your nature rather than against it, to partner with forces instead of binding them. This may give you a chance." "Then help us make it enough," Zeus said. "Stand with us, advise us. We need wisdom as much as strength." Prometheus considered this for a long moment, his eyes distant, seeing futures that branched and diverged like rivers finding their ways around obstacles. Finally, he nodded slowly. "I will stand with you, but know that my aid comes with price. I ask nothing now, but when this war is done, when you sit in authority and make the rules that will govern the new age, remember that I helped. Remember that some debts must be acknowledged even when their payment is inconvenient." Zeus agreed, not knowing yet what this promise would cost, not understanding that some bargains shape destinies more surely than any battle. More came in the days that followed. Styx, the ancient river goddess, whose oath would become the binding force by which even gods would swear their truths. She knelt before Zeus and offered alliance, her dark waters pledging to support the younger gods, to lend them power drawn from depths older than time's current measure. The 3 hecatoncheires arrived on the 12th day, vast and terrible, their 100 hands empty, but their presence enough to make the plateau feel crowded despite its size. They had been freed from Tartarus by Zeus, remembered kindness when no kindness was owed, and now offered strength that could match entire Titan armies. And the Cyclopes came, emerging from hidden forges where they had fled after their own imprisonment ended. They brought gifts, objects they had crafted in fire and darkness, items that hummed with power not quite safe to touch. For Zeus, a thunderbolt, not a weapon yet, but potential, captured lightning bound into form that hands could hold without burning. It was beautiful and terrifying, a rod of bronze inlaid with lines that glowed blue-white, that seemed to pull at the air around it, that made the hair on his arms stand on end even when it lay dormant. For Poseidon, a trident. 3-pronged, forged from metal that seemed to flow like water, that rang when struck with a sound like waves breaking on distant shores. It felt heavy in the hand, but light in intention, a tool for shaping currents and commanding tides. For Hades, a helmet. Not armor but obscurement, a crown that wrapped shadow around its wearer until they vanished, not from existence but from notice, from attention, from the awareness of those who looked directly at them, yet somehow forgot to see. The Cyclopes bowed low when presenting these gifts, their single eyes gleaming with satisfaction at work. Well done. "We forge for those who freed us," their leader said, his voice like grinding stones. "We forge to repay the debt of chains broken and dignity returned. Use these well, young gods. They were made from elements that predated this world's current form. They will not fail you if you do not fail yourselves. With each arrival, with each oath sworn and alliance formed, the plateau of Olympus grew less like refuge and more like fortress. Not walls of stone, but walls of will, circles of power that overlapped and reinforced, creating space that was becoming something more than simply mountaintop. It was becoming the seat of new authority, the anchor point for transformed cosmos, the place where the future was preparing to announce itself. But even as their strength grew, even as allies gathered and powers crystallized into mastery, Zeus felt the weight of what approached. Felt it in the way the clouds refused to break completely, in the way birds avoided flying near the mountain, in the way the very stones seemed to hold their breath. Kronos was gathering his forces in the north. The old Titans, his brothers and sisters who had ruled since creation began, were marshalling power accumulated over ages beyond counting. They were coming, not in haste but with terrible patience, bringing with them the weight of established order, the momentum of eons, the assumption that what has always been will always remain. On the 15th night after the rain ended, Zeus stood again at the plateau's edge, looking out into darkness unmarked by stars. Prometheus joined him, silent at first, simply sharing the watch. "You're afraid," the Titan said eventually, not as accusation but as observation. "I am," Zeus admitted, seeing no purpose in denial, not of pain or defeat, though both are possible. "I'm afraid of what it will cost, how many will die, how much will be destroyed. Whether we can actually build something better than what we're tearing down, or if we're simply replacing one flawed rule with another." Prometheus nodded slowly. "That fear is wisdom." Kronos never felt it. He acted from certainty, from the belief that power justified itself. But power without doubt becomes tyranny. Power that questions itself, that accepts its own limitations, that is the foundation of something that might actually deserve the name justice. He placed a hand on Zeus's shoulder, the gesture surprisingly warm from one known more for intellect than comfort. "The war will come. It cannot be avoided now. Too many have chosen sides, too much has been set in motion. But remember, when you stand against your father, that you fight not just for victory, but for the right to prove that rule can be something other than fear. That burden will be heavier than any crown." Zeus stood with those words, felt their weight settle into him alongside all the other burdens he was gathering. Below them, the world waited. Above them, the clouds began finally to break, revealing stars that had been hidden for weeks, ancient lights that had witnessed every age since light first learned to travel. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled. Not from rain, not from storm, but from forces gathering, from powers moving into position, from the old king preparing his answer to the challenge that had been laid before him. The Titanomachy was approaching. And Zeus, standing beneath stars newly visible, surrounded by allies and siblings, armed with impossible weapons and barely mastered powers, understood that everything they had done so far had been preparation. Now came the proving. Now came the war that would determine whether the cosmos could be ruled by something other than consumption and fear. Now came the days when gods would learn whether they were truly divine or simply powerful children playing a transformation they could not complete. The stars watched. The mountain waited. And somewhere in the dark, Kronos was coming. The dawn that followed was not gentle. It arrived without color, without the soft gradations that usually mark the transition from night to day. Instead, light simply replaced darkness in a single moment, as if the world had been switched on rather than awakened. The air felt brittle, charged with potential that made every breath taste of copper and ozone. Zeus found his siblings already gathered at the central hearth, where Hestia's flame still burned with its impossible constancy. They looked different now, he noticed. Not older exactly, but settled into themselves in ways they had not been even days before. Hera stood straighter, her bearing royal without effort. Demeter's hands moved with certainty, measuring herbs she was grinding into paste with steady rhythm. Poseidon leaned against stone, relaxed but watchful, his eyes holding that new depth like wells that went down to the center of the world. Hades emerged from shadow rather than entering from any door, his presence announced only by the subtle shift in how darkness fell across the space. They did not speak at first. Words seemed unnecessary when what needed to be communicated lived in the space between breath and intention. They were six. They were one. They were ready, or as ready as beings barely grown into their power could ever be. The allies had begun to gather as well, moving through the plateau in patterns that suggested purpose without organization. The hecatoncheires positioned themselves at the northern edge, their 100 hands hanging loose, but their attention fixed on the horizon, where gray sky met gray land without clear boundary. The cyclopes worked at a forge they had built overnight, flames dancing blue and green as they shaped metal into forms that hummed with purpose not yet revealed. Nymphs and spirits moved like water through spaces between stones, their forms shifting between solid and translucent, depending on light and need. Prometheus stood slightly apart, his attention divided between watching the preparations and watching Zeus with an expression that might have been concern or might have been curiosity about how the experiment he had chosen to support would ultimately unfold. Styx had taken position near the fountain, her dark waters mingling with Poseidon's creation, lending it depth that had not been there before. The mountain itself seemed to vibrate with a frequency just below hearing, a thrumming that came up through stone and into bone, marking time toward something inevitable. Birds still refused to fly near, clouds hung motionless overhead. Even the wind had stilled, as if the world were holding its breath. Zeus walked the perimeter of the plateau, touching stone, feeling how the mountain had transformed under the pressure of gathered power. It was no longer simply rock. It had become something else, infused with intention and oath, and the collective will of beings who had chosen to stand here against what approached. The boundaries glowed faintly when he concentrated, visible as silver-blue lines that marked where protection became invitation. He could feel Kronos approaching before he could see him. The sensation started as pressure against the edges of awareness, a weight pushing against the wards they had established. It grew steadily, not quickly but without pause, the way tides rise or glaciers advance. By midday, the horizon had darkened, not with storm clouds but with presence, with the gathered might of Titans who had ruled since the first ordering of chaos into form. They came across the land like a slow wave, their numbers impossible to count, their power making the air shimmer with heat that had nothing to do with temperature. Kronos stood at their center, and Zeus could see him now despite the distance. His father had not diminished in imprisonment or defeat. If anything, he seemed larger, as if rage had inflated him beyond his previous boundaries. The sickle that had castrated Uranus hung at his side, dark metal that drank light rather than reflecting it. Around him, the older Titans formed a wall of ancient authority. Oceanus, whose rivers encircled the world. Hyperion, who had carried sun before Helios was born. Coeus and Creus, whose names were spoken only in whispers. Iapetus, father of Prometheus, whose expression showed nothing when he saw his son standing with the enemy. They stopped at a distance Zeus estimated as half a day's walk for mortals, though distance meant different things when gods measured it, close enough for words to carry. Far enough that the first strike would require choice rather than reflex. Kronos' voice reached the plateau without him raising it, carried on currents that had nothing to do with air. Child of mine who should not exist. Rebels who choose destruction over order. I offer you one chance to end this without bloodshed. Kneel. Return to my authority. Accept that the rule of Titans is eternal and cannot be overthrown by infants playing at divinity. Zeus felt his siblings shift behind him, felt their anger and their fear and their determination tangling together into something that tasted like bronze. He knew what they expected. A defiant speech. Words that would be remembered and repeated when the story of this day was told in ages to come. But he remembered what Prometheus had said about wisdom and doubt, remembered standing in rain learning the language of storms, remembered that control and partnership were not the same thing. Father. His voice carried back across the distance, quieter than Kronos's, but somehow clearer, as if it traveled through a different medium entirely. I give you the same chance.
Yield.
Acknowledge that the age of Titans has passed. Step down from authority you claim through fear rather than consent. Allow the cosmos to evolve beyond the patterns you have enforced since time's beginning. Silence followed. Even the mountain's thrumming paused, waiting for the response that would determine whether talking or fighting would follow. Kronos laughed. The sound was not amused. It was the laugh of stone grinding against stone, of tectonic plates shifting. I am time. I am order. I am the foundation upon which everything stands. You cannot replace me any more than rivers can flow uphill or shadows can exist without light to cast them. Your defiance is meaningless. You will kneel or you will be destroyed, and either way, my rule continues. He raised the sickle, and the Titans behind him began to move forward, slowly at first, then faster, covering ground with strides that bent space to accommodate their passage. Zeus did not move, did not draw the thunderbolt. He simply stood, watching them come, feeling how his siblings tensed behind him, how the allies prepared for impact, how the very mountain braced itself for collision. Then, when the Titans were close enough that individual faces could be distinguished, Zeus raised his hand, not in attack, in invitation. Then come, he said quietly. Come and teach us whether power truly justifies itself. Come and prove that what has always been must always remain. He lowered his hand, and something happened that he had not planned, had not anticipated. The mountain responded to him, not because he commanded it, because it agreed. The plateau expanded, not physically, but by becoming more than it had been. Space folded and multiplied, creating room for what was coming, preparing itself to hold forces that should have torn it apart. The sky, which had been gray and featureless, suddenly cracked open. Through the breaks in clouds, light poured down in shafts that illuminated the plateau from above, while casting the approaching Titans into shadow. And Zeus understood, in that moment, what his father had never learned. That true power did not come from forcing the world to obey. It came from becoming the kind of being that the world chose to support. The Titans crashed against the plateau's edge like a wave against a cliff. But the cliff did not break. It held, absorbed the impact, redirected force around itself rather than meeting it head-on. Zeus drew the thunderbolt, felt it come alive in his hand, felt it pull power from the sky above and the stone below and the very air between. He did not aim it. He simply opened himself to what it wanted to do, became conduit rather than wielder. The first bolt struck Kronos squarely, sent the Titan staggering back, his form crackling with energy that had forgotten how to disperse. The second caught Crete, wrapping him in light that bound rather than burned. Poseidon raised his trident, and the fountain erupted upward, becoming a pillar of water that split into 100 streams, each one finding a target, each one carrying weight that should have been impossible for liquid to possess. Titans stumbled, slipped, fell to their knees on suddenly treacherous ground. Hades drew shadow up from the mountain's depths, not darkness but absence, spaces where Titans stepped and found nothing to support them, falling through what looked like solid ground into places between that held them suspended. The hecatontures moved forward, and their 100 hands became a storm of their own, striking from all angles simultaneously, creating patterns of impact that could not be defended against. The battle had begun. Not with speech or ceremony, simply with the meeting of forces that could not coexist, could not yield, could not do anything except collide and discover which would break first. Kronos came through the chaos like a blade through cloth, untouched by water or lightning or shadow. He moved with the terrible grace of something that had never known defeat. The sickle swept in arcs that cut more than flesh, that severed connections between intention and action. Zeus met him in the center of the plateau, and they clashed with impact that cracked stone and split the air and made the mountain scream with stress. Father and son. Old authority and new claim. They did not speak. Words were finished. Now there was only the testing, the proving. Zeus struck with lightning that should have burned anything it touched. Kronos deflected with the sickle, and the bolt scattered into harmless sparks. Kronos swung the dark blade, and Zeus caught it on the thunderbolt shaft, metal screaming against metal. Around them, the battle expanded. Titans fell and rose and fell again. Hera had joined the fighting, her strength not in weapons but in will, in the ability to hold spaces against invasion through sheer refusal to yield. Demeter sang, and the earth responded, growing thorns and vines that tangled Titan feet. The Cyclopes threw hammers that struck with the weight of mountains. Styx's waters rose up in waves that washed away certitude. Prometheus moved through the chaos offering advice, suggesting tactics, pointing out weaknesses with the detachment of one who had already seen how this would end, but watched anyway to observe the details. The sky, torn open by that first crack, now raged with its own storm. Not rain, but raw weather, patterns clashing and reforming, wind fighting wind. Zeus felt himself changing as he fought, growing into the power he had been born to claim, but also growing beyond it, discovering capacities he had not known existed. He learned to pull lightning from clear air, to shape thunder into force that could push as well as destroy. Kronos, by contrast, did not change. He fought as he had always fought, with the absolute conviction that power required no evolution, no adaptation, and in that refusal to change, Zeus saw the opening he needed. He stopped meeting force with force. Instead, he began to move with the flow of battle rather than against it, redirecting rather than resisting, using Kronos' own momentum to create opportunities for strikes that came from angles the Titan King had not considered. The sickle swept past Zeus's head by a margin so thin that his hair stirred in its passage. He stepped inside the arc, brought the thunderbolt up in a strike that caught Kronos beneath the ribs, drove light and force deep into the body that had once devoured his siblings. Kronos staggered. For the first time in the battle, for perhaps the first time in ages beyond counting, he staggered. The plateau held its breath. The fighting around them paused as gods and titans alike turned to watch. Kronos looked down at the wound in his side, at light leaking out like blood that had forgotten its proper color. He looked up at Zeus, and in his ancient eyes something flickered that might have been surprise or might have been recognition. "You have learned," he said quietly, and for just a moment he sounded not like a tyrant, but like a father observing his son's growth with something uncomfortably close to pride. Then the moment passed. The sickle rose again. The battle resumed. But Zeus knew now what he had not known when the day began. Victory was possible. Not certain, not guaranteed, but possible. And possibility was all that any revolution required to justify its attempt. The sun, hidden for so long behind gray clouds, finally broke through. Light poured down onto the plateau, illuminating the battlefield, casting shadows that stretched long and dark toward the north. And Zeus, standing against his father with lightning in his hand, and allies at his back, and the weight of future ages pressing against his shoulders, understood that whatever happened next, the cosmos had already changed. The question now was only whether that change would take root, or be torn up before it could grow into something that would last. The battle raged on, and the mountain held, and somewhere far away mortals who knew nothing of gods or titans looked up at sudden storm and wondered what the heavens were arguing about with such violence and such terrible, beautiful fury. The battle did not end with sunset. Battles between gods rarely consulted the convenience of solar schedules. Instead, The fighting transformed as darkness fell, becoming something stranger and more terrible than daylight combat. Shadows gained depth and weight. Lightning no longer illuminated, but carved shapes from blackness that existed between strikes. The plateau, which had held firm through all the violence of the day, began to show signs of strain, not in its stone but in the spaces between stones, in the subtle ways that reality bent under sustained pressure from forces it had not been designed to contain. Zeus found himself fighting in a rhythm he had not consciously learned, but that his body knew with the certainty of blood and bone: strike, redirect, absorb, release. The thunderbolt had become an extension of his arm rather than a tool he wielded. He could feel weather patterns shifting overhead, responding to his movements the way instruments respond to a musician's touch. When he raised his left hand, clouds gathered. When he turned his shoulder, wind changed direction. The integration was seamless, automatic, profound. Kronos, by contrast, fought with the same techniques he had employed for eons. The sickle traced patterns older than memory, arcs that had not changed since the first rebellion. There was terrible beauty in his consistency. No wasted motion, no hesitation. Every strike came from the certainty of absolute authority, from the belief that power once claimed could never be legitimately challenged. The difference between them, Zeus realized during a brief pause while both combatants circled each other across stone slick with something that resembled rain but tasted of ozone and possibility, was not merely one of age or strength. It was philosophical. Kronos believed that rule meant control, that authority flowed from the ability to consume, to contain, to prevent change through eternal vigilance. Zeus was discovering something else entirely, though he lacked words for it yet. That rule might mean relationship. That power could come from connection rather than domination. Around them, the broader battle had fragmented into smaller engagements. Poseidon faced Oceanus near the fountain, Trident meeting ancient river in clashes that sent water spiraling upward in columns that hung suspended in air, defying gravity through sheer force of divine will. The two sea powers circled each other with the patience of tides, neither willing to commit fully, both understanding that this particular fight might last longer than the war itself. Hera had taken on Tethys, and their battle was quieter than most, conducted through glances and gestures that rearranged space itself. Where Hera pointed, air became solid. Where Tethys gestured, stone turned liquid. They moved through a landscape that shifted between states of matter according to rules only they understood. Hades fought no one. Instead, he had positioned himself at what might be called the battle's edge, though edges had become uncertain as the plateau expanded and contracted according to need. From there he worked with shadow, pulling darkness up from depths the mountain had not known it contained, creating pools of absence that Titans stumbled into and found difficult to escape. His expression remained neutral throughout, neither pleased nor distressed. Demeter sang. Her voice rose above the chaos, not loud but somehow penetrating, reaching through thunder and impact to touch stone and root and the deep earth that remembered when Gaia herself had walked freely. Where her song traveled, things grew. Not gently, not naturally, but with urgent violence. Vines erupted through rock, wrapping around Titan ankles. Trees burst from soil that should have been too thin to support them, branches tangling overhead to create barriers that shifted and moved. Hestia remained at the central hearth, maintaining the flame that had not faltered since this place became sacred space. Her role seemed passive, but Zeus understood now that it was foundational. The flame anchored them. Without it, the plateau would lose coherence, would fragment into the chaos that always threatened when too much power gathered in too small a space. The hecatontures had found their rhythm, moving in patterns that created the impression of a single organism with 300 hands rather than 3 separate beings. They struck in waves, each wave coordinated with precision that made strategy seem like choreography. Titans fell, rose, fell again under impacts that came from angles impossible to predict or defend against. The Cyclopes had abandoned the forge to join the fighting directly, and they brought with them tools that hummed with purpose. When Brontes struck Creus with a hammer still hot from its making, the Titan screamed not in pain but in confusion, as if the blow had disconnected him from something essential. When Steropes threw a chain forged from starlight and intention, it wrapped around Hyperion and held him immobile, despite strength that should have shattered any restraint. Prometheus still did not fight. He moved through the battlefield like a scholar taking notes, observing, occasionally offering quiet words to gods who listened when they had breath enough to hear. Zeus caught fragments as his father drove him past where the Titan stood. Consider leverage rather than force. Notice how chaos favors his right side after that strike. Interesting that shadows hold better when anchored to memory rather than absence. Kronos heard none of this. Or if he heard, he gave no sign. His focus remained absolute, fixed on Zeus with intensity that made the air between them crackle. "You think you have won something," Kronos said during a moment when their weapons locked and they stood face to face, neither able to advance or retreat. His voice was conversational, almost gentle. "You think that because you stand against me, because you have not yet fallen, that the cosmos has changed. But power does not shift because children declare it should. Power remains with those who understand its true nature, with those willing to do what succession requires." Zeus pushed back, broke the lock, created space between them. "You ate your children," he said quietly. "Not from necessity, from fear. Fear that they might become what you became. That the pattern you created through violence might continue through you. And you would break that pattern?" Kronos laughed, the sound like millstones grinding. "You, who gathered weapons and allies and waged war against your father, you who strike at the foundation of all order, you are me, boy. Perhaps worse, because you pretend your violence serves justice rather than ambition." The words hit harder than any physical blow. Zeus felt them land, felt them seek purchase in doubts he had carried since this began. Was he simply repeating the cycle? Overthrowing one tyrant to become another? Using prettier words to justify the same fundamental hunger for power that had driven every transition since chaos first formed into something capable of wanting? He thought of Prometheus's question, of doubt as wisdom rather than weakness, of the difference between controlling weather and partnering with it. "Perhaps," he acknowledged, and saw surprise flicker in Kronos' ancient eyes. "Perhaps I am you. Perhaps this is the same story told again with different names. But if so, then that pattern itself demands examination. If power can only perpetuate through violence, if rule requires consumption, if order must be maintained through fear of what comes next, then perhaps power and rule and order as you understand them are the problem." He raised the thunderbolt, but differently than before. "Not as weapon, but as invitation. I offer partnership. To you. To any Titan willing to acknowledge that the cosmos is large enough for multiple forms of authority, multiple ways of maintaining balance." Silence fell across the plateau. Even the fighting paused as gods and Titans alike turned to hear what Kronos would say to this unprecedented offer. The old king stood motionless for a long moment, sickle lowered, expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice carried something that might have been genuine sorrow. "You do not understand what you offer. Partnership requires equality. And I am time itself. I am the foundation. There can be no partnership with that which underlies everything. There can only be acceptance or denial, submission or destruction." He raised the sickle again, and Zeus saw in that gesture the answer to every question he had asked, every doubt he had entertained. Some powers could not imagine existing differently than they had always existed. Some authorities could not conceive of legitimacy earned rather than claimed. "Then we understand each other," Zeus said softly. "And there is nothing more to discuss." What followed was not fighting so much as inevitability unfolding. Zeus moved with certainty he had not possessed even hours before, striking not from anger, but from acceptance of what necessity required. The thunderbolt sang in his hands, pulling power from sources he was only beginning to understand. Sky and stone and water and the spaces between. The collective will of beings who had chosen to stand with him. The support of a cosmos that was, perhaps, ready for something different. Kronos met him with equal certainty, with the absolute conviction of eternal authority that could not imagine its own ending. The sickle that had castrated Uranus, that had ruled through fear for ages beyond counting, swept through air that tried to hold it back. They clashed at the center of the plateau, and this time something broke. Not stone. Not weapons. But the pattern itself, the cycle that had governed divine succession since time became distinct from chaos. Zeus struck not at his father's body, but at the authority Kronos had wrapped around himself like armor. Lightning found the spaces where power connected to identity, where rule had fused with self, until they could not be separated. Each bolt severed a thread, dissolved a connection, unpicked stitches that had held for eons. Kronos screamed, not in pain but in recognition. In understanding, finally, that he had lost not because Zeus was stronger, but because the cosmos had decided to support a different story. The sickle fell from his hand, clattered against stone that no longer trembled. Around the plateau, the remaining Titans slowly lowered their own weapons, seeing in their king's defeat the end of an age they had never imagined could conclude. Zeus stood over his father, thunderbolt raised, and the entire battlefield held its breath, waiting to see whether the cycle would continue, whether the son would consume the father as the father had consumed his children. Instead, Zeus lowered the weapon. "No," he said quietly, "that story ends here." He turned to the Hecatoncheires, who approached with surprising gentleness for beings with 300 hands between them. "Take him to Tartarus, not as punishment, but as ending. The age of Titans is finished. Let them rest in the depths, remembered but no longer ruling." As Kronos was led away, his expression showed something Zeus had never seen there before. Not pride, not rage, but something uncomfortably close to relief. As if some part of him had been waiting for this. As if eternal rule had been burden as much as privilege. The other Titans followed without resistance. Oceanus paused as he passed Zeus, meeting the young god's eyes with a gaze that held depths beyond measuring. "Rule well," he said simply. "Or do not rule at all. But whatever you choose, remember that time does not stop simply because kings change." Then he too descended into Tartarus, and the plateau, which had held against such violence, such collision of impossible forces, finally allowed itself to crack. Not catastrophically. Just enough to release the pressure that had been building in stone and space, and the foundations of reality itself. Zeus watched his siblings gather around him. Hera, proud and assured. Demeter, still singing softly to the vines that would not release their grip without her permission. Poseidon, water dripping from hair and beard, grinning with the satisfaction of someone who had enjoyed a good fight regardless of its cosmic significance. Hades, emerging from shadows with expression that gave away nothing. And Hestia, finally leaving her post at the central hearth now that the battle had concluded and the flame could rest without abandoning its purpose. They did not celebrate. Victory, Zeus was learning, rarely felt the way poets described it. There was relief, yes. There was satisfaction that they had survived. But there was also exhaustion and uncertainty about what comes next, and the lingering question of whether anything they had accomplished would last beyond this moment. Prometheus approached, and Zeus saw approval in the Titan's eyes. Not for violence or victory, but for restraint. For choosing a different ending than the pattern had demanded. "You have won a war," Prometheus said quietly. "Now comes the harder task, winning peace, creating something that functions not through fear of overthrow, but through actual justice." That will require wisdom you have not yet acquired, and allies you have not yet met, and probably several centuries of mistakes that future generations will judge harshly. Encouraging, Zeus said dryly. Truth often isn't. Prometheus smiled. But you ask for wisdom, and wisdom requires acknowledging that victory is beginning, not conclusion. The cosmos expects maintenance, not mere conquest. As dawn approached, genuine dawn this time, with colors that had been earned through darkness rather than simply appearing, Zeus climbed to the highest point of the plateau and looked out across a world that was suddenly, impossibly, his responsibility. The sky stretched endless above him, waiting to be understood and honored and worked with rather than controlled. The earth spread below, scarred by battle, but already beginning its patient work of healing. And somewhere in the depths, Titans rested in Tartarus, their age ended but their story preserved, remembered, acknowledged as necessary precursor to everything that would follow. Thunder rolled gently across the horizon, and Zeus realized it was responding to him without him calling it. The storms knew him now, recognized him as something more than wielder of lightning. As partner, as the being who had chosen relationship over domination. His siblings joined him on the height, and together they watched the sun rise over Olympus, over the world they would shape and serve and struggle to understand for ages beyond counting. Below, the mountain slowly released its battle tension, letting stone remember how to be simply stone. The fountain rang clear again. Birds, cautious and uncertain, began to circle overhead. Life, persistent and stubborn, started its work of returning to places that had known only violence hours before. Zeus took a deep breath and let it out slowly. The war was over. The real work was about to begin. And he, the hidden child who had grown in secret, who had freed his siblings and gathered allies and fought his father to a standstill, was about to learn the hardest lesson divine beings ever face. That claiming power is easy compared to the endless, patient, often thankless work of wielding it wisely. The crown settled on Zeus's head without ceremony. There was no ritual, no coronation conducted by priests who traced their authority back through generations. The authority came from something simpler and more fundamental. He had stood at the end of a cycle that had repeated since consciousness first emerged from chaos, and he had chosen to break it rather than continue it. That choice, witnessed by sky and stone and the beings who would live beneath both, carried weight that no ceremony could add to or diminish. In the weeks following the battle, Olympus transformed from military encampment into something approaching a home. Divine architecture requires more than stone and mortar. It requires agreement about what spaces should hold, what boundaries should mean, how privacy and community might coexist when those negotiating such matters possess power to reshape reality according to preference. Hera claimed a wing of the palace that overlooked the eastern valleys, where morning light struck first and lingered longest. She spent hours in consultation with nymphs, who understood design, creating spaces that balanced grandeur with intimacy. Her chambers reflected her nature, structured but not rigid, beautiful but not soft, commanding respect without demanding submission. Demeter chose grounds rather than buildings, claiming an expanse of terraced gardens where soil ran deep and seasons could be observed in their proper progression. She walked those spaces at dawn and dusk, hands trailing through earth that responded to her presence, understanding growth in ways that Zeus was only beginning to appreciate. The gardens became sanctuary, not just for her, but for any who needed reminder that power could nurture rather than simply command. Poseidon remained restless. He visited Olympus, participated in councils, offered opinions on matters of governance, but his attention kept drifting toward the sea that called from beyond the mountain's base. Zeus could see the longing in his brother's eyes, the way he stood at cliff edges watching waves that caught sunlight and transformed it into moving patterns of silver and foam. The ocean required a king who dwelt within rather than above it, Hades came and went like shadow, present during discussions that required his input, absent otherwise. He had begun exploring Tartarus, not merely as prison guard, but as ruler of realm that preceded and would outlast any surface kingdom. The dead were gathering. Mortals whose brief lives ended found themselves without clear destination, wandering between existence and absence in confusion. Someone needed to create order from that uncertainty. Hades, who understood endings better than any of them, accepted that responsibility with characteristic silence. Hestia established the central hearth that would burn eternally atop Olympus, flame that anchored the palace and everyone within it. She tended that fire personally, refusing offers of assistance, understanding that some work could not be delegated without losing essential meaning. The hearth became gathering place, the spot where councils convened and decisions were made, and gods who might otherwise splinter into individual concerns remembered they belonged to something larger. Zeus watched his siblings create their domains and understood that his crown meant less than their willingness to remain here, to contribute to vision, still forming, still being negotiated with every conversation and compromise. Authority flowed not from position, but from the complicated work of building trust among beings who had every reason to suspect consolidation of power. The question of succession haunted him. Not immediately, not urgently, but with persistence that grew stronger rather than weaker as days accumulated into weeks. Kronos had feared being overthrown because he had overthrown his own father. The pattern ran deep, carved into cosmic expectations about how power transferred between generations. Breaking that cycle required more than simply not eating his children. It required reimagining what fatherhood itself might mean for beings who could not die, but could still be diminished, imprisoned, cast down. Meti came to Olympus during this period of uncertain establishment. The Titaness of wisdom had remained neutral during the war, observing without committing, which had allowed her to survive when others fell or were imprisoned. She moved through the palace with quiet grace, noticing details others missed, offering observations that clarified without instructing. Zeus found himself drawn to her company. Metis possessed intelligence that functioned differently than strength or authority, that could see patterns before they fully formed and understand implications before they manifested. When she spoke, which was less often than most, her words carried weight that made other conversations seem hasty and unconsidered. They walked together through gardens. Demeter had coaxed into early bloom, discussing governance challenges Zeus faced with increasing complexity. How to maintain authority without becoming tyrant. How to encourage growth while preventing chaos. How to honor allies without creating dependencies. How to build something that might last longer than single reign. You cannot solve succession through strategy, Meti told him as they paused beside a fountain where water played across stone carved to resemble breaking waves. The question is not how to prevent being overthrown. The question is whether being overthrown necessarily constitutes failure. Zeus considered this, watching light refract through water into colors that had no names. Kronos thought maintaining power constituted success. That rule measured by duration rather than quality. "And you think differently?" Metis's voice held genuine curiosity rather than challenge. "I think power that requires fear to maintain itself is already failure, regardless of how long it lasts. But I do not yet know what power maintained through trust looks like, or whether such power can survive beyond single generation." Metis smiled, expression thoughtful. "Then perhaps your reign will teach you, and perhaps what you learn will matter more than how long the learning takes." Their relationship deepened naturally, inevitably, in the way that connection forms between beings who recognize in each other qualities they themselves lack but value: wisdom and strength, foresight and decisiveness, patience and passion. The combination felt complete in ways Zeus had not experienced before. When Metis became pregnant, Zeus felt joy uncomplicated by fear. He would be father not through consumption, but through creation. He would raise children, teach them, share with them the cosmos that was their inheritance. The pattern truly would be broken. Then Gaia visited him at dusk, while he stood watching storm clouds gather over distant valleys. The primordial earth goddess appeared rarely in physical form, preferring to communicate through growing things or geological shifts, or simply presence felt in soil and stone. Her manifestation beside him on the palace's highest terrace carried significance that made Zeus's throat tight before she spoke. "Your child will be daughter," Gaia said without preamble, voice like wind through deep caves. "Wise beyond measure, powerful beyond imagining, she will be glory to you and asset to Olympus." Zeus waited. Divine beings who delivered good news rarely paused with such weight. "The second child will be son, and he will possess strength greater than yours, authority that exceeds yours. He will overthrow you as you overthrew your father, as your father overthrew his." The words fell like stones into deep water, spreading ripples that would not stop spreading. The pattern continues. The cycle persists. This is not curse. This is simply nature of power that perpetuates through violence. You broke pattern once, but you broke it with force, and force carries its own momentum. The storm cloud Zeus had been watching suddenly felt less distant, less metaphorical. Thunder rolled across valleys, not from his calling, but from atmospheric pressure building toward inevitable release. "What would you have me do?" His voice stayed level through effort that made his hands tremble. "I would have you choose. Between fatherhood and rule, between child and crown, between love and fear." She paused, and when she spoke again, her tone held something uncomfortably close to pity. "I would have you be wiser than those who came before. But wisdom comes from suffering, and suffering from choices no one should have to make." She faded before Zeus could respond, leaving him alone with prophecy that poisoned everything it touched. Days passed. The pregnancy showed in Meti with divine swiftness, her belly swelling as if seasons compressed their changes into hours. Zeus watched her move through palace spaces with grace unchanged, discussing cosmic architecture with Hephaestus, debating ethical frameworks with Prometheus, laughing with Demeter over garden designs that incorporated mathematical principles into aesthetic beauty. He could not speak the prophecy aloud, could not share the choice Gaia had offered, could not explain why he stared at Meti with expression she finally noticed, finally questioned. "Something troubles you," she said one evening while they sat together in chambers she had claimed as her own, walls lined with scrolls and star charts and diagrams that mapped relationships between concepts he had never considered might be connected. Zeus looked at her, at the woman who carried his child, at intelligence that saw patterns in chaos and understood implications before they manifested. At wisdom he had been drawn to precisely because it offered perspectives he could never achieve alone. "A prophecy," he said finally, "about our child. About power that would exceed mine, about cycles that continue despite efforts to break them." Meti nodded slowly, unsurprised. "You fear becoming your father. I fear that claiming authority through force creates momentum that cannot be redirected through mere desire for different outcome. And you think consuming me will prevent this?" Meti asked calmly, "You think that swallowing wisdom protects against pattern wisdom itself has identified?" Zeus stared at her. "How did you know?" "Because it is what Kronos would do, what the pattern demands." The threatened ruler consuming the threat. She stood, moved to window overlooking gardens where moonlight painted plants in shades of silver and shadow. "The question is whether you are capable of choosing differently." "I do not know." Zeus's admission felt like confession, like revealing weakness that would be exploited. "I want to believe I am. Want to believe that wisdom can guide me towards solution that breaks pattern without perpetuating it. But wanting belief is not same as possessing it." Métis turned to face him, and in her eyes Zeus saw neither fear nor judgment, but something more complex. Understanding, perhaps. Or the strange acceptance that comes from seeing inevitable conclusion and choosing grace within limitation, rather than fighting uselessly against it. "You will do what you must," she said quietly. "Kings always do. The measure is not whether you consume me, but what you do with wisdom once it resides within you, rather than beside you." She crossed to him, placed one hand against his chest, directly over his heart. "Do not waste this. Do not let fear guide what wisdom should shape. Promise me that." Zeus tried to speak, to offer reassurance or apology, or some combination that might bridge the space opening between them. But Métis leaned forward, kissed him gently, and in that moment transformed herself into water. She flowed over him, around him, into him before he could react or refuse or make choice that had already been made by forces larger than individual will. The wisdom that had guided him, challenged him, helped him imagine rule beyond domination, became part of him, integrated so completely that he could no longer distinguish his thoughts from hers. He stood alone in empty chamber, hand pressed against chest where her palm had rested, feeling movement within him that was not merely absorbed tightness, but child she carried. Daughter. Athena. Wisdom born from wisdom, growing now in place no prophecy had anticipated. The crown on his head felt heavier, the palace around him felt emptier. And Zeus, king of gods and breaker of patterns, understood with terrible clarity that some cycles cannot be escaped, only transformed. That power claimed through violence carries that violence forward regardless of intention. That becoming father while holding authority meant forever balancing love against fear, trust against survival, hope against prophecy that waited patiently for fulfillment. He had wanted to be different than Kronos, had believed that wanting might be enough. But wisdom that now resided within him whispered uncomfortable truth. That difference was measured not in single choice, but in accumulated choices made across eternity. That breaking pattern required not dramatic gesture, but patient daily work of choosing transformation over consumption, relationship over control, trust over fear. The work ahead felt impossible. The weight felt unbearable. And Zeus, standing in chambers that still held scent of intelligence he had absorbed, understood that this too was part of rule. That crown came with burdens that could not be set down, choices that could not be unmade, knowledge that poisoned innocence without granting peace. Below, in gardens Demeter tended, night flowers opened to moonlight, releasing fragrance that drifted through palace windows. Life continuing its patient work, regardless of divine drama, regardless of kings and prophecies and patterns that persisted, despite all efforts to break them. Zeus breathed deeply, accepting what could not be changed, carrying what could not be set down. The daughter growing within him stirred with consciousness that already felt ancient, and he placed palm against the place where she rested, promising nothing except that he would try, would keep trying. Would fail and try again and fail better. It was not the victory he had imagined, but it was the truth wisdom required him to acknowledge, and perhaps acknowledgement itself was where breaking patterns truly began. The years that followed taught Zeus what no prophecy could have warned him about. That power measured itself not in thunderbolts thrown or titans chained, but in quiet moments when choices too small for songs accumulated into character that even gods could not escape. The crown remained on his head, but its weight shifted with each decision, each compromise, each moment when he chose connection over control or failed to, and had to live with the consequence. Athena emerged from his head fully formed during a council meeting, born with a war cry that shook marble columns and sent doves scattering from their roosts in the palace eaves. She came armored and wise and fierce, carrying in her grey eyes the intelligence of her mother blended with the authority of her father, neither entirely one nor the other, but something new that the world had not seen before. Zeus looked at his daughter, at wisdom given form and breath and choice, and felt pride mixed with grief, that Meti could not witness what they had created together. Themis came after, the titaness of divine law and order, bringing to his rule what Metis had brought to his heart: structure, framework, understanding that justice required not only power but principles that guided how that power manifested. She bore the Horai, goddesses of seasons and order, and the Moirai, the three fates who spun and measured and cut the threads of mortal lives with dispassion that even Zeus could not influence. From Themis he learned that some things must stand beyond even kingly reach, that true authority recognized its own limitations and drew strength from acknowledging rather than fighting them. But it was Hera who became his queen, proud and jealous and regal, whose temper matched his own and whose presence commanded respect from gods and mortals alike. Their marriage was never simple. She knew of his wanderings, of mortal women who caught his eye and bore his children, of divine dalliances that produced gods who would claim their places on Olympus. Her anger was legendary, her vengeance against his lovers and their offspring becoming stories that mortals told in whispers. Yet she remained beside him, queen of heaven, goddess of marriage, who understood that unions between powerful beings required negotiation more than romance, patience more than passion. The children came, divine and mortal, each carrying pieces of their father but shaped by their mothers and their own natures into beings he could not fully predict or control. Apollo and Artemis, born of Leto, twin lights who embodied art and hunt, civilization and wildness. Hermes, quicksilver clever, born of Maya in a cave and stealing cattle before sunset of his first day. Dionysus, twice born from mortal woman, and Zeus's own thigh, god of wine and madness and ecstatic release from order that his father represented. Ares, born of Hera in response to Athena's birth, war made flesh and blood, violent where his sister was strategic. Each child taught Zeus something about fatherhood that he had not anticipated. That raising offspring meant releasing control while maintaining guidance. That divine children possessed power that could threaten cosmic order if mishandled or neglected. That love for children felt different than love for siblings or lovers, carried weight that made his chest tight when he watched them learn and grow and make their own inevitable mistakes. The mortal children were different still. Perseus, Heracles, Helen, Pollux, heroes and beauties, whose lives burned bright and brief against the eternal canvas of divine existence. Zeus watched them from Olympus, sometimes intervening, sometimes restraining impulse to interfere with fates that unfolded according to patterns even he could not alter. He learned grief through them, the particular sorrow of immortals who loved mortal beings and watched time consume them, watched promising lives end in violence or sickness or simple accumulation of years. Heracles proved most difficult, most beloved, most complicated. Zeus saw in his mortal son the same strength that ran through his own bloodline, watched the hero endure labors that would have broken lesser beings, witnessed the madness and murder that resulted from Hera's jealous intervention. When Heracles finally earned immortality, dying on a pyre and ascending to Olympus as god, Zeus felt relief that at least one beloved child would not vanish into death's permanent embrace. The role of father transformed him in ways conquest never had. He discovered that protecting required different skills than commanding. That teaching meant acknowledging his own uncertainty. That loving beings who possessed independent will and choice meant accepting they would sometimes choose poorly, hurt themselves and others, become strangers despite shared blood. But fatherhood also taught joy that war had never offered. Pride watching Apollo compose music that made stars pause in their rotation. Delight at Hermes' clever tricks and quicksilver charm. Satisfaction when Athena resolved conflicts through wisdom rather than force. Even the difficult children, the ones who struggled or rebelled or disappointed, taught him patience that authority alone could never have developed. Olympus filled slowly with divine children and their offspring, creating networks of relationship that complicated governance even as they enriched it. Zeus learned to navigate family politics more treacherous than any war council, to balance Hera's legitimate anger against his genuine affection for children born outside their marriage, to protect vulnerable offspring from his wife's vengeance without undermining her authority as queen. The work proved exhausting in ways battle never had been. Warfare possessed clarity, enemies identified, objectives defined, victory or defeat measured in concrete terms. Family offered no such simplicity. Every choice created ripples that affected beings he loved in contradictory ways. Protecting one child often meant failing another. Honoring Hera's position sometimes required decisions that hurt children who deserved better from their father. Yet he persisted, learning as he went, failing and adapting and trying again. The crown on his head felt less like triumph and more like responsibility that could not be set aside even when its weight became nearly unbearable. He was father to gods and mortals, protector of both, judge of both, and the role admitted no rest, no respite, no moment when he could simply be Zeus without considering how his choices would affect the cosmic web of relationships that extended from his throne. The mortals multiplied below Olympus, building cities and temples, offering sacrifices and prayers that rose like smoke through clear air. Zeus watched civilizations rise and fall, watched humanity learn agriculture and writing and war, watched them develop concepts of justice and governance that sometimes mirrored and sometimes contradicted divine examples. He established himself as protector of guests and hosts, enforcer of oaths, guardian of order against chaos that always threatened to overwhelm the fragile structures consciousness built against entropy. The relationships he formed with mortals proved complicated. He desired them, loved them, sometimes genuinely cared about their well-being beyond mere appetite, but immortality created distance that even sincere affection could not bridge. He would persist while they faded, remember them while their great-grandchildren forgot. The gulf between divine and mortal experience made true understanding impossible, though he kept trying, kept reaching across that divide with mixed results and complicated consequences. The younger gods gradually claimed their roles and domains. Aphrodite emerged from sea foam, born of Uranus's severed flesh, bringing love and desire that disrupted carefully ordered arrangements with delightful and dangerous regularity. Hephaestus, born of Hera alone in angry response to Zeus's independent creation of Athena, became master craftsman whose works shaped how gods and mortals understood beauty and function. Each new addition to the divine hierarchy required negotiation, boundary establishment, definition of responsibilities that prevented overlap and conflict. Olympus became true court, complete with alliances and rivalries, romances and feuds, moments of transcendent harmony and periods of bitter dispute. Zeus presided over it all, sometimes wise, sometimes foolish, learning that perfect rule existed only in theory, while practice required constant adjustment, compromise, willingness to acknowledge mistakes without being destroyed by them. The prophecy about his own overthrow lingered in thoughts. Metis's absorbed wisdom made more nuanced but no less troubled. Athena showed no desire to claim his throne. But prophecy rarely unfolded in expected ways, and Zeus remained alert for threats that might emerge from directions he could not anticipate. The vigilance exhausted him some days. The fear that he might become his father despite all efforts to choose differently haunted him in quiet moments. Yet he did choose differently, repeatedly, in ways both large and small. He did not consume his children. He taught rather than threatened. He built rather than merely conquered. The differences accumulated slowly, like sediment settling into new patterns, like water wearing stone into shapes that served rather than merely endured. The cosmos found its rhythm under his rule. Seasons turned according to agreements negotiated between gods of various domains. Justice, imperfect but present, shaped both divine and mortal society. Art and music and poetry flourished, inspired by gods who valued creation alongside destruction. Humanity developed not only technologies of survival, but philosophies of meaning. asking questions about existence that even gods struggled to answer satisfactorily. Zeus understood that his reign's success could not be measured during his rule, but only by what came after, by whether the systems he established proved resilient enough to outlast his direct oversight. The thought brought neither comfort nor distress, simply recognition that some questions required time's passage for proper answer. The palace around him had become home in truest sense, filled with beings he loved, despite their complications, decorated with memories both cherished and painful. The throne room where councils convened, the gardens where children played and couples walked, the hearth Hestia tended with patient dedication, the library where Athena studied alongside mortals granted rare access to divine knowledge. Each space carried weight of lived experience, of choices made and consequences accepted. Thunder rolled across distant valleys, called by atmospheric pressure rather than divine will. Zeus listened to it from the balcony that overlooked the world he had fought to rule and then learned to serve. The sound reminded him of simpler times, of clarity that warfare provided, but he no longer wished for that simplicity. The complexity of peace, of family, of governance that required wisdom more than strength, this was the harder work, the more meaningful work, the labor that would define his legacy more surely than any battle. If you find rest in these ancient stories of gods and struggles that mirror our own, perhaps you'll return to Olympus dreams for more journeys through myth and meaning, where the old tales ease modern minds toward peaceful sleep. The eternal patterns continue their patient work, teaching what they've always taught about power and love, choice and consequence, the ways beings of any kind must learn to live with their decisions. And Zeus, the hidden child who became king, the rebel who became father, the warrior who learned wisdom through necessity and pain, remains where he has always been, seated on his throne beneath the stars, lightning bolt at rest, watching over a world that still needs watching, still requires the steady presence of authority that protects rather than threatens, that serves rather than simply rules, that endures through the long night while mortals sleep and dream of gods who are not so different from themselves.